The security guard laughed when Keanu Reeves told him he had a meeting inside the resort. Standing beneath the massive stone entrance of Pinecrest Golf Resort, he looked nothing like the wealthy members arriving in luxury SUVs and custom golf carts. His gray hoodie was slightly worn, his jeans were faded, and the small travel bag hanging from his shoulder looked completely out of place among the designer luggage surrounding him. Several members walking toward the clubhouse slowed down to watch, sensing the beginning of an uncomfortable scene. The guard looked Keanu up and down twice before shaking his head with a smirk. He asked who had invited him, and when Keanu calmly replied that he was there to meet the resort owner, a few nearby golfers actually laughed out loud. One man standing beside a golf cart muttered something to his friend, while a woman in expensive tennis attire covered her mouth to hide a smile. The guard clearly believed he had caught someone pretending to be important, and the growing crowd seemed more interested in the embarrassment than the truth. For a moment, the entrance gate felt less like a luxury resort and more like a stage. The guard stepped closer and pointed toward the road leading back to town. He told Keanu that people spent more money on a weekend golf package than the clothes he was wearing were worth. Several members exchanged amused looks, and one businessman even pulled out his phone as if he expected the confrontation to become entertaining. Through it all, Keanu remained completely calm. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, and didn't make any attempt to reveal who he really was. What nobody standing there understood was that the quiet man they were mocking had changed more lives than most of them could imagine. And what the security guard definitely didn't know was that less than 10 minutes later, a black SUV approaching the entrance would bring the entire resort to a standstill and leave everyone at that gate wishing they had chosen their words far more carefully. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories about kindness, justice, unexpected life lessons, and inspiring moments, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Now let's begin. The morning air over Pinecrest Golf Resort carried the kind of quiet luxury that money couldn't stop talking about. Rolling green fairways stretched across the hills beneath a clear autumn sky, while expensive vehicles lined the circular driveway outside the clubhouse. Members moved through the property with an easy confidence that came from belonging. Some headed toward the first tee with custom golf bags. Others gathered on the terrace overlooking the course, enjoying coffee and conversation before their rounds began. Everything about the resort projected exclusivity, from the stone entrance gates to the polished brass signs that reminded visitors they were entering one of the most prestigious private clubs in the state. Into that world stepped Keanu Reeves. He arrived, alone in a modest rental sedan that looked completely ordinary compared to the luxury vehicles surrounding it. Dressed in a gray hoodie, faded jeans, and worn brown boots, he attracted attention almost immediately. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because he seemed so out of place. The people arriving that morning had learned to judge success through appearances. Expensive watches, tailored clothing, and luxury cars acted like unofficial membership cards long before anyone checked an actual guest list. Keanu parked near the entrance and stepped out carrying a small travel bag. His expression remained calm as he admired the property for a moment. The early sunlight reflected across the fairways, and groundskeepers were already preparing the course for another busy day. It was the kind of peaceful scene most people would have appreciated. Unfortunately, not everyone was focused on the scenery. From inside the security booth, Dale Hutchins noticed him immediately. Dale had worked at Pinecrest for more than a decade. Over the years, he had developed what he considered a reliable instinct for identifying who belonged at the resort and who didn't. Most mornings passed without incident because members arrived in recognizable vehicles and greeted him by name. But the sight of a casually dressed man stepping out of a rental car immediately triggered his suspicion. Before Keanu had even reached the gate, Dale had already formed an opinion. When Keanu approached the security booth and politely explained that he was there to meet someone, Dale barely looked interested. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and asked for a membership card. Keanu calmly explained that he wasn't a member and had been invited as a guest. The answer only deepened Dale's skepticism. "A guest?" Dale repeated. "Who's expecting you?" "Charles Beaumont," Keanu replied. For the first time, Dale laughed, not because he found anything funny, but because he believed the answer was ridiculous. Charles Beaumont wasn't just another member. He was the owner of Pinecrest Golf Resort. His name carried enormous influence throughout the club, and very few guests were invited personally by him. Several nearby members overheard the exchange. A businessman loading clubs into a golf cart glanced over with amusement. A woman sitting inside a luxury SUV slowed her vehicle to listen. The conversation had suddenly become more interesting than the routine start of another day at the resort. Dale folded his arms and stared at Keanu for several seconds. "You're telling me the owner invited you personally?" "That's correct," Keanu answered. His voice remained calm and respectful. No attitude, no frustration, no attempt to prove himself. The reaction seemed to irritate Dale even more. He grabbed a guest list from his desk and flipped through several pages with exaggerated slowness. Every few seconds he shook his head as though confirming what he already believed. Finally, he placed the clipboard down and looked directly at Keanu. "I don't see your name." Keanu nodded slightly. "There may have been a mistake. Would you mind calling someone inside to verify it?" The request was completely reasonable. Unfortunately, reason wasn't what was driving the conversation anymore. By now, several members had stopped nearby. Nobody openly interrupted, but people were watching. Some appeared curious. Others looked entertained. The atmosphere had begun shifting from a simple misunderstanding into something much more uncomfortable. Dale stepped out of the security booth and pointed toward the road leading away from the resort. "If you're looking for public golf courses, there are plenty around here," he said. "This isn't one of them." A few people chuckled. Keanu heard them. He simply stood there without reacting. The calmness should have ended the confrontation. Instead, it seemed to encourage it. Dale interpreted Keanu's patience as weakness, the same mistake many people make when they encounter someone who doesn't feel the need to argue. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Luxury vehicles continued arriving behind them. Members entered through the gate. Conversation slowed as more people noticed the situation unfolding at the entrance. What had started as a routine morning was quietly turning into a public spectacle, and standing at the center of it all was Keanu Reeves, carrying a small travel bag, dressed like an ordinary traveler, being treated as though he had no business standing there. What nobody knew yet was that a simple phone call made only minutes earlier had already set something important in motion. Inside the resort, someone had just discovered that an invited guest was being held at the front gate, and before the next half hour was over, the entire atmosphere at Pinecrest Golf Resort would begin to change. End of Section 1. The uncomfortable scene at the front gate should have ended after a few minutes. Most people would have either lost their temper or simply driven away. Keanu did neither. After another brief attempt to explain that he had been invited, he quietly returned to his rental car and waited. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. If anything, he seemed unusually relaxed for someone being treated like an unwelcome stranger. That calmness only made Dale Hutchins more convinced that he was dealing with someone who didn't understand how places like Pinecrest worked. From inside the security booth, Dale watched the rental car closely. Every few minutes he glanced toward it while continuing his normal duties. Members arrived in expensive vehicles and were waved through with friendly greetings. Some noticed the man sitting alone in the rental sedan and asked questions. Dale answered with subtle confidence, suggesting there had been some confusion about a guest claiming to know the owner. Each retelling made the situation sound slightly more ridiculous than the one before. Before long, several members had formed opinions without ever speaking to Keanu themselves. The rumors began spreading almost immediately. Near the clubhouse entrance, two golfers discussed the situation while waiting for their tee time. One claimed the man at the gate was probably trying to sneak into the resort. Another guessed he was hoping to meet someone famous. Neither had any actual information, but that didn't stop the conversation. Human nature has always enjoyed filling empty spaces with assumptions, and exclusive places like Pinecrest often encouraged exactly that kind of behavior. Meanwhile, Keanu remained in the driver's seat, occasionally looking out toward the golf course. The morning sunlight reflected across the fairways, and grounds crews continued preparing the property for the day. To anyone watching from a distance, he appeared completely unaffected. That quiet patience puzzled a young employee named Priya Sharma, who worked as an event coordinator for the resort. She had been reviewing preparations for the afternoon charity fundraiser when she received an unexpected call asking about a guest being held at the entrance. When Priya checked the guest list, her stomach dropped. Keanu Reeves was supposed to be inside already. A scheduling error had prevented his name from being transferred to the gate list that morning. It was a simple administrative mistake, but the consequences were becoming increasingly obvious. Without wasting a second, Priya climbed into a golf cart and headed toward the entrance. The closer she got, the more concerned she became. At the gate, Dale noticed the approaching cart and immediately relaxed. He assumed Priya was arriving to confirm his decision. Instead, the moment she stepped out, her expression told a very different story. She walked directly toward Keanu's vehicle. "Mr. Reeves," she said apologetically, "I am so sorry. We had a communication error this morning. You absolutely belong here." Several people nearby froze. The name alone caused a few heads to turn, but most still didn't make the connection. Keanu simply smiled. "No problem," he said. "These things happen." Priya apologized again before opening the gate personally and escorting him onto the property. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute, yet it left Dale feeling strangely uncomfortable. He couldn't explain why. As far as he knew, it was merely a paperwork issue being corrected. Still, something about the situation lingered in his mind. Inside the resort, Keanu was driven toward the clubhouse where preparations for the charity fundraiser were underway. The event honored Daniel Webb, the late son of longtime member Marcus Webb, and was expected to attract dozens of influential guests later that evening. Staff members moved quickly between banquet rooms and outdoor terraces, arranging decorations and preparing presentations. As Keanu walked through the clubhouse, something unexpected happened. He thanked people. Not just once. Repeatedly. The woman arranging flowers near the lobby received a warm thank you. The employee cleaning windows near the dining room received one too. Even a young worker carrying stacks of folded chairs received a smile and a few kind words. None of it seemed important in the moment, but several employees would remember those interactions long afterward. Unfortunately, not everyone inside the resort shared the same attitude. At a large table near the dining room windows sat 3 longtime members. Gregory Ashworth, Franklin Cole, and Warren Lind had spent years enjoying the privileges that came with Pinecrest membership. They weren't openly cruel men, but they had developed the habit of judging people almost instantly. Expensive environments often create that weakness in people without them realizing it. When Gregory noticed Keanu walking through the clubhouse, he frowned. The gray hoodie immediately caught his attention, so did the worn boots, and the fact that Keanu looked nothing like the wealthy guest typically invited to private functions. Gregory leaned toward Franklin and quietly made a comment. Franklin laughed. Warren turned to look. Within seconds, all 3 men were watching. "I thought there was a dress code here," Gregory said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Few people smiled awkwardly. Others pretended not to listen. Keanu continued, walking as though nothing had happened. That seemed to frustrate Gregory even more. Some people enjoy getting reactions. When they don't receive one, they often push harder. Throughout lunch, similar comments continued appearing around the clubhouse. Guests whispered. Staff members exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody knew exactly who Keanu was, but plenty of people had opinions about how he looked. The strange part was that every negative comment seemed to create the opposite reaction among employees. The more people judged him, the more staff members noticed how respectfully he treated everyone around him. He thanked. Servers held doors open, asked workers about their day, remembered names after hearing them only once. Those small details began creating a sharp contrast between perception and reality. By mid-afternoon, Pinecrest Golf Resort had quietly divided into 2 groups. One group saw an ordinary man who didn't seem to belong. The other saw someone whose character stood out far more than his clothing. And somewhere in the middle of that growing tension, rumors started spreading through the clubhouse. Several employees were beginning to ask the same question. Why would a man like this be personally invited to one of the most important charity events of the year? Nobody had the answer yet. But before the day ended, that answer would change everything. As the afternoon continued, the atmosphere around Pinecrest Golf Resort slowly began to change. The whispers and judgment hadn't disappeared, but something else was happening beneath the surface. The people who actually interacted with Keanu Reeves were walking away with a very different impression than the one being formed by those watching from a distance. While some members remained focused on his appearance, employees were starting to notice the kind of person he was. Keanu spent much of the afternoon exploring the property, while preparations for the evening fundraiser continued. He wasn't accompanied by an assistant or surrounded by attention. He simply walked through the resort at an easy pace, occasionally stopping to admire the golf course or speak with employees working nearby. Several staff members later admitted they didn't even realize they were talking to a famous actor. They just knew he was unusually kind. Near the maintenance area behind the clubhouse, a young groundskeeper named Miguel was struggling to move several heavy bags of landscaping material onto a utility cart. The bags were awkward and difficult to lift alone. Most guests passed by without noticing. Others noticed and kept walking. Keanu stopped immediately. "Need a hand?" he asked. Miguel looked surprised. Before he could answer, Keanu had already picked up one of the bags. For the next several minutes, the two worked together, loading supplies onto the cart. They talked casually while they worked. Keanu asked how long Miguel had been employed at Pinecrest. He asked about his family. He asked whether he enjoyed the job. The questions weren't forced or performative. They felt genuine. Miguel eventually admitted he was attending community college at night while working full-time during the day. His goal was to study environmental management and eventually work in golf course design. Most people would have responded with polite encouragement and moved on. Keanu listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions about his plans. By the time they finished, Miguel felt something he hadn't expected. He felt respected, not because someone famous had spoken to him, because someone had genuinely cared about what he had to say. A similar moment happened. Less than an hour later, inside the clubhouse, a young server named Thomas accidentally dropped an expensive tray of drinks near one of the dining areas. The crash immediately attracted attention. Conversation stopped. Several guests turned around. Thomas froze. His face turned red. The drinks had spilled near a table occupied by several influential members, and he immediately began apologizing. One member rolled his eyes. Another shook his head with visible irritation. Thomas looked as though he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Before any manager could arrive, Keanu stepped forward. He grabbed several napkins from a nearby service station and began helping clean the spill. "It's okay," he said calmly. "Everyone has days like this." The simple comment immediately reduced the tension. Thomas later admitted he would remember those words for years, not because they were profound, because he desperately needed to hear them in that moment. The incident spread quickly among employees. Staff members often share stories during shifts, and before long, people throughout the resort were talking about the guest in the gray hoodie who helped employees instead of demanding attention. Every news story seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was simply who he was. Meanwhile, the contrast between Keanu and some of the resort's members continued growing stronger. At one point during the afternoon, Gregory Ashworth watched from across the terrace as Keanu spoke with several employees. Gregory still couldn't understand why the man had been invited to such an important event. In Gregory's mind, status mattered. Appearances mattered. Certain environments belonged to certain types of people. Keanu challenged those assumptions without even trying. The more Gregory watched him, the more irritated he became. People often become uncomfortable when reality refuses to support their first impression. On the terrace overlooking the golf course, Keanu eventually sat alone with a cup of coffee, while staff members prepared tables for the evening fundraiser. The view stretched across rolling hills and perfectly maintained fairways. The late afternoon sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and green. A housekeeping employee named Rosa happened to be passing through the area when she noticed him sitting alone. Most guests barely acknowledged housekeeping staff. Keanu smiled and greeted her. Then he asked how her day was going. The question caught her off guard. For several minutes, they talked about her children, her work schedule, and her hopes of eventually buying a home. Keanu listened attentively, never glancing at his phone or looking distracted. When the conversation ended, Rosa walked away feeling strangely emotional, not because of anything dramatic, because kindness had become so rare in places built around status. As the afternoon progressed, more employees began sharing similar stories. The groundskeeper, the server, the housekeeper, the maintenance crew, the event staff, every interaction painted the same picture. The guest in the gray hoodie treated everyone with dignity, not just important people. Everyone by now. Priya had started noticing something interesting. Employees genuinely liked having Keanu around. People smiled more when he entered a room. Conversations became warmer. The atmosphere shifted. Without trying to become the center of attention, he somehow made people feel seen. And while employees were developing a growing admiration for him, another type of conversation was beginning elsewhere inside Pinecrest. Guests had started recognizing him. At first, it happened quietly. A second glance, a longer stare, a whispered conversation. A phone being pulled from a pocket, someone thought he looked familiar. Someone else insisted they had seen him before. No one was completely sure yet, but curiosity was spreading. The rumors that had started as judgment were slowly transforming into questions, and before long, those questions would lead to a discovery that would leave the entire resort stunned. By late afternoon, Pinecrest Golf Resort was operating under two completely different versions of reality. Employees saw a polite, humble guest who treated everyone with respect. Some members, however, still viewed him as an outsider who somehow didn't fit the image they expected from an exclusive private club. What neither group realized was that a third perspective was beginning to emerge. People were starting to think they recognized him. The first person to notice was a woman named Karen Whitmore, a retired attorney who had been a Pinecrest member for nearly 15 years. She was sitting near the terrace windows when she happened to glance toward the outdoor seating area. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A casually dressed man sat alone with a cup of coffee while overlooking the course. But something about his face caught her attention. Karen looked again, then a third time. The feeling grew stronger. She knew that face. The problem was that she couldn't immediately remember where. For several minutes, the question bothered her. Finally, she pulled out her phone and quietly searched through a few photos online. The moment she found what she was looking for, her eyes widened. "No way," she whispered. Her husband noticed immediately. "What is it?" Karen turned her phone toward him. "Look." He stared at the screen, then toward the terrace, then back at the screen. His expression changed. Instantly, "That's impossible." But it wasn't. Across the terrace, completely unaware of the growing attention, Keanu continued enjoying his coffee while watching golfers finish their rounds below. Within minutes, the conversation spread to another table, then another, then another. People who had ignored him earlier suddenly found themselves taking second looks. Some members walked past more slowly than necessary. Others pretended to be interested in nearby decorations while secretly looking in his direction. The whispers became impossible to miss. "Doesn't he look familiar? Wait a second. Is that who I think it is? I don't know. No, seriously, look at him. For the first time all day, the attention wasn't focused on his clothes. It was focused on his identity. The change happened gradually, but once it started, it accelerated quickly. Near the clubhouse entrance, two younger members pulled out their phones and began comparing pictures online. A server carrying drinks overheard part of their conversation and nearly dropped the tray when he realized who they were discussing. Another employee quietly informed a co-worker. Within 20 minutes, half the resort seemed to be having the same conversation. Yet despite the growing rumors, nobody approached him. Part of the reason was uncertainty. People didn't want to embarrass themselves by being wrong. The other reason was that Keanu gave no indication he wanted attention. He wasn't taking photographs. He wasn't introducing himself. He wasn't behaving like someone expecting recognition. If anything, he seemed determined to avoid becoming the center of attention. That only made the mystery stronger. Inside the clubhouse dining room, Gregory Ashworth was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. At first, he dismissed the rumors entirely. Then he overheard the same conversation from 3 different groups. Then he noticed employees whispering. Then he noticed people staring. For the first time all afternoon, doubt entered his mind. Not doubt about the rumors, doubt about his own assumptions. The possibility that he might have judged someone incorrectly was not a pleasant thought, especially because he had been so publicly confident across the resort. Similar realizations were beginning to unfold. Employees who had spent hours speaking with Keanu suddenly connected the pieces. Thomas remembered his face from movies. Rosa recognized his voice. Miguel recalled seeing interviews years earlier. One by one, people started understanding exactly who had been walking through the resort all afternoon. But the most interesting reaction came from those who already admired him before they knew his name. The discovery didn't change their opinion, it simply explained it. The kindness, the patience, the humility, those qualities had impressed them long before they learned he was famous. As the afternoon continued, Priya found herself caught between amusement and concern. She knew exactly what was happening. She watched conversations spread across the terrace like ripples moving across water. Every few minutes another person recognized him. Every few minutes another rumor appeared. And every rumor seemed to make the atmosphere more tense, not because people disliked Keanu, because they were starting to realize how badly some individuals had treated him earlier. That realization made certain conversations extremely uncomfortable. One employee mentioned the gate incident. Another mentioned comments in the dining room. Someone else remembered hearing jokes about his clothing. Suddenly, those moments didn't seem harmless anymore. They felt embarrassing. By early evening, the fundraiser guests had started arriving. Luxury vehicles filled the parking area. The clubhouse became increasingly crowded. Business leaders, community figures, longtime members, donors, athletes, everyone gathered for the scholarship fundraiser honoring Daniel Webb. Yet despite the growing crowd, one question seemed to dominate every conversation. Was Keanu Reeves really here? The answer remained unofficial. Nobody had publicly confirmed it. That uncertainty created even more anticipation. People kept watching, waiting, wondering. Meanwhile, Keanu remained exactly the same person he had been all day. He spoke kindly to employees, thanked staff members, helped move a few chairs when preparations fell behind schedule. He behaved as though none of the whispers existed, and perhaps the most remarkable part was that he genuinely didn't seem concerned about what anyone thought of him. That calmness only deepened the mystery, because most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to control how others see them. Keanu seemed completely free from that. Sorry, sir. As sunset approached, golden light washed across the resort. Guests gathered near the terrace where the fundraiser would soon begin. Conversations continued. Rumors multiplied. Phones appeared more frequently. And then something happened that immediately silenced every question. Near the front entrance of the clubhouse, a luxury black SUV rolled to a stop. Several employees straightened instantly. Senior staff members exchanged looks. Even long-time members paid attention. Only one person arrived in that vehicle, Charles Beaumont, the owner of Pinecrest Golf Resort. And within minutes, his arrival would transform rumor into certainty and leave the entire resort speechless. End of section 4. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Pinecrest Golf Resort entered its most beautiful hour of the day. Golden light stretched across the fairways, reflecting off clubhouse windows and turning the entire property into something that looked almost cinematic. Guests continued arriving for the Daniel Webb Scholarship fundraiser, and conversations filled the terrace overlooking the course. Yet despite the importance of the event, one topic seemed to dominate nearly every table. People were talking about Keanu Reeves. Some were convinced it was him. Others still weren't sure, but everyone was curious. The rumors that had started as quiet whispers were now spreading openly throughout the resort. Guests who had never spoken to him found themselves discussing him. Employees exchanged knowing looks whenever his name came up. The mystery that had been building all afternoon was reaching a breaking point. Unfortunately, not everyone was handling that uncertainty gracefully. Gregory Ashworth had spent most of the day trying to convince himself that the growing speculation meant nothing. But every passing minute made that harder to believe. He had already made comments about Keanu's appearance. He had already questioned whether he belonged at the club. If the rumors were true, then those comments suddenly looked very different. And Gregory didn't like that feeling at all. Instead of becoming more cautious, he became more defensive. People often do. When pride feels threatened, some individuals double down rather than admit they might have been wrong. That decision would soon become a very public mistake. Near the terrace, Keanu stood alone, looking out across the course while guests gathered behind him. He appeared completely relaxed. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, and distant golfers were finishing their final holes of the day. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful. Then Gregory approached several nearby guests immediately. Noticed. Conversation slowed. People sensed tension. Before a single word was spoken, Gregory stopped a few feet away and folded his arms. "Enjoying the view?" he asked. His tone sounded friendly on the surface, but there was something sharp underneath it. Keanu turned and smiled politely. "It's beautiful here." Gregory nodded. "Yes, it is." For a brief second, it seemed as though the conversation might remain civil. Then Gregory glanced toward Keanu's hoodie. His expression changed. "You know, most people make a little more effort when attending events like this." The nearby conversation stopped almost. Immediately, everyone understood what he was implying. Keanu remained calm. "Suppose everyone has different priorities." Few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. The response was polite. Too polite. Gregory had expected defensiveness. Instead, he received composure. That only frustrated him more. He stepped slightly closer. Still, appearances matter in places like Pinecrest. The words hung in the air. Several people turned toward the conversation. Others pretended not to listen while listening very carefully. Keanu simply nodded. "Sometimes they do." The answer wasn't argumentative. It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't even confrontational. Yet somehow it exposed the weakness in Gregory's comments without directly challenging him. That made Gregory visibly uncomfortable. Crowd noticed, and when people notice embarrassment, they usually keep watching. At another table, Warren Lind quietly shook his head. Even Franklin Cole looked uneasy now. What had started as casual judgment earlier in the day was becoming something much more public. But Gregory wasn't finished. He glanced toward several nearby guests and forced a laugh. "Well, I suppose confidence is important too." A few people laughed awkwardly. Most did not. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier, people had viewed Keanu as an outsider. Now many of them were beginning to sympathize with him. The shift was subtle but powerful. For the first time all day, Gregory found himself standing on the wrong side of public opinion. Unfortunately, he didn't realize it. Instead, he pushed even harder. "So tell me," he said, "how exactly did you end up at Pinecrest?" The question wasn't genuine curiosity, it was a challenge. Several guests looked away. Others stared directly at Keanu. Employees, watching from nearby service stations, froze in place. Everyone could feel what was happening. Keanu could have ended the conversation instantly. He could have revealed his identity. He could have embarrassed Gregory. He could have proven exactly who he was. Instead, he simply smiled. "A friend invited me. Nothing, or nothing less." Gregory stared at him. The answer clearly wasn't satisfying. The crowd grew quieter. People were now actively hoping Gregory would stop talking, but pride rarely listens to good advice. "Quite a friend," Gregory said. "Because this club usually has standards." The words landed harder than anything he had said before. A visible reaction moved through the crowd. Several employees looked shocked. One guest actually closed his eyes. Even Warren shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time all day, Gregory's comments felt undeniably cruel. And suddenly the entire terrace seemed to understand. Keanu remained perfectly calm. Anger, no resentment, no attempt to defend himself, just quiet dignity. That response accomplished something Gregory never expected. It made him look smaller. The stronger Gregory pushed, the stronger Keanu appeared, not because he fought back, because he didn't need to. At that exact moment, Priya appeared near the terrace entrance. Her expression changed. Immediately, she had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She started walking toward Them fast, very fast. Gregory, she said firmly. Perhaps we should focus on tonight's fundraiser. The message was clear. Stop now, Gregory forced a smile. I'm only making conversation. Nobody believed him, not even Gregory. For several long seconds, silence settled across the terrace. The tension had become almost unbearable. Then, something unexpected happened. A resort employee rushed across the courtyard toward Priya. He leaned close and whispered something into her ear. Her eyes widened instantly. She turned toward the clubhouse entrance. Several senior staff members were suddenly moving with unusual urgency. Guests began noticing. Conversations stopped. People started looking toward the main driveway. A luxury black SUV had just pulled up outside. The vehicle door opened, and as a familiar figure stepped out, an invisible wave of anticipation swept across the entire resort. Charles Beaumont had arrived. The owner of Pinecrest Golf Resort was here, and within the next few minutes, every assumption made throughout the day was about to collapse. End of Section 5. The moment Charles Beaumont stepped out of the black SUV, the atmosphere at Pinecrest Golf Resort changed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Employees immediately straightened their posture. Members who had been casually socializing only moments earlier suddenly paid attention. Charles wasn't just the owner of the resort. He was one of the most respected figures in the entire organization, and when he arrived unexpectedly, people noticed. But what happened next was something nobody saw coming. Charles barely acknowledged the crowd. He didn't stop to greet longtime members. He didn't speak with event organizers. He didn't pause for introductions. Instead, he walked directly across the courtyard with purpose, his eyes fixed on a single person, Keanu Reeves. A strange silence followed him as he crossed the terrace. Guests exchanged confused looks. Several people glanced between Charles and Keanu, trying to understand what was happening. Even Gregory Ashworth appeared. Uncertain now, the owner reached Keanu and immediately smiled. Not a polite smile, not a professional smile. The smile of someone genuinely happy to see an old friend. Keanu, Charles said warmly as he extended his hand. I've been looking forward to this all month. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The entire terrace seemed frozen. Then Keanu smiled and shook his hand. It's good to see you too, Charles. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, stunned expressions. People who had spent all afternoon questioning whether Keanu belonged suddenly found themselves witnessing something they couldn't explain away. Charles Beaumont wasn't treating him like a guest. He was treating him like someone he deeply respected. Several employees exchanged looks of relief. Others tried not to smile. They had known the truth for hours. Now everyone else was finally catching up. Charles looked around the terrace and immediately sensed the tension. He was an experienced businessman. Reading a room came naturally to him. Something had happened. He could feel it. His attention shifted briefly toward Priya. She didn't need to say anything. The expression on her face told him, enough. Then he noticed Gregory standing nearby, and he noticed the uncomfortable silence surrounding him. Charles wasn't a man who needed long explanations. The pieces came together quickly. Still, he kept his composure. Keanu has been kind enough to support tonight's fundraiser, Charles said to the crowd. In fact, this event wouldn't be nearly as successful without people like him. The statement landed like a thunderclap. Several guests stared openly. Others looked embarrassed. Many suddenly remembered comments they had made throughout the afternoon. The realization spread across the terrace one person at a time. The man they had judged based on a hoodie and jeans wasn't some confused visitor. He was one of the most important guests at the entire event. Gregory felt his stomach tighten. For the first time all day, he had no response. The confidence that had fueled his earlier comments was disappearing quickly because the problem was no longer whether Keanu belonged. The problem was that Gregory had repeatedly questioned someone who clearly belonged more than he did. Charles continued speaking naturally, completely unaware of the full extent of the day's events. When Marcus first asked me to host this fundraiser, Keanu was one of the first people to offer support. Not publicity, Not attention. Just support. Several guests looked at Keanu differently. Now, the admiration was visible not because he was famous, because everything they had witnessed suddenly made sense. The kindness toward employees, the patience, the humility, the complete lack of ego, it all fit together. Meanwhile, across the property, another person was receiving unpleasant news. At the front gate, Dale Hutchins was finishing paperwork when a golf cart stopped beside the security booth. The employee driving it looked unusually serious. "Charles is here," she said. Dale nodded. "So?" The employee hesitated, then she explained, very carefully, very clearly. The guest he had refused entry that morning was Keanu Reeves, the same Keanu Reeves who was standing beside the resort owner at that exact moment. The same Keanu Reeves who had personally supported the scholarship fundraiser. The same Keanu Reeves who had been invited directly by Charles Beaumont. For several seconds, Dale said absolutely nothing, his expression slowly changed, then changed again. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Not because Keanu was famous, because he suddenly remembered every detail of their interaction, the assumptions, the attitude, the dismissive comments, the certainty that he didn't belong. Dale stared across the property toward the distant clubhouse. For the first time all day, he began seeing the situation through a different lens. Back on the terrace, the crowd was still processing what had happened. Charles and Keanu spoke comfortably, like people who had known each other for years. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, just genuine friendship. That simple fact somehow shocked people more than anything else. The owner of Pinecrest wasn't doing Keanu a favor. He was grateful Keanu had come, and suddenly, dozens of conversations from earlier in the day became deeply embarrassing. Guests remembered the whispers, the laughter, the assumptions, the comments about clothing, the jokes, the stares. One by one, those moments returned to people with uncomfortable clarity. Yet despite the growing shock, the story was far from over, because while the crowd had finally learned who Keanu Reeves was, they still didn't know why he was there. They didn't know about the lives he had quietly changed. They didn't know about the students. They didn't know about the families. They didn't know about the support that had remained hidden for years, and when those truths finally emerged later that evening, the impact would be far greater than anyone imagined. End of section 6. As the applause from Charles Beaumont's introduction slowly faded, the atmosphere across Pinecrest Golf Resort felt completely different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. The whispers had stopped. The judgment had disappeared. People who had spent the afternoon questioning Keanu Reeves now found themselves studying him with curiosity and respect. Yet while most guests assumed the biggest surprise of the evening had already happened, they couldn't have been more wrong. The fundraiser officially began shortly after sunset. Warm lights illuminated the terrace overlooking the course, creating a beautiful scene against the darkening sky. Round tables filled with donors, members, and community leaders stretched across the patio. At the center stood a small stage displaying photographs of Daniel Webb, the young athlete whose memory inspired the scholarship fund. Marcus Webb stepped to the podium first. The room immediately quieted. For several minutes, he spoke about his son with a mixture of pride and sadness that touched everyone listening. He talked about Daniel's love for sports, his dreams for the future, and the devastating loss that changed his family's life forever. Many guests lowered their eyes as he spoke. Others quietly wiped away tears. When Marcus finished, the audience responded with a standing ovation. The emotion in the room was genuine, but once everyone sat down again, Marcus's expression shifted. Something seemed to be bothering him. Charles noticed it immediately. So did Priya. So did Keanu. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. Again, there is something else I need to share tonight. The room grew quiet once more. Marcus glanced toward several scholarship recipients seated near the front, young men and women, students, athletes, dreamers, kids, whose futures depended on opportunities like this one. Then he delivered the news. The scholarship fund was facing a serious financial challenge. A major donor who had supported the program for years had recently withdrawn their commitment after unexpected business losses. The missing contribution represented hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next several years. A visible wave of concern moved through the audience. Several guests exchanged worried looks. Others immediately began doing mental calculations. Everyone understood what this meant. Without replacement funding, future scholarships would be reduced, maybe significantly. Some students would lose opportunities. Some dreams would be delayed. Others might disappear entirely. The emotional atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer just a celebration, it had become a problem. Serious one. Near the back of the audience sat Miguel. The young groundskeeper Keanu had helped earlier that afternoon. He had been invited because he was one of the scholarship program's newest applicants. Few people knew his situation. Even fewer knew how much was riding on the outcome of tonight's fundraiser. Miguel's father had suffered a workplace injury 2 years earlier. Medical bills had piled up. College expenses felt impossible. The scholarship represented something far bigger than financial assistance. It represented hope, and now that hope suddenly felt uncertain. Nearby, several other students shared similar concerns. One young woman hoped to become a physical therapist. Another dreamed of coaching college athletics. A young man seated beside them wanted to study engineering. Every scholarship mattered, every opportunity mattered, and now the future of the entire program seemed unclear. The tension in the room became impossible to ignore. Even Charles Beaumont looked troubled. For years, the Daniel Webb Scholarship Fund had transformed lives throughout the community. Losing momentum now would affect dozens of future students, perhaps hundreds. As guests quietly discussed the situation, another story was unfolding behind the scenes. Several Pinecrest employees were facing difficulties of their own. Thomas, the young server Keanu had comforted earlier, was struggling to pay tuition for hospitality management classes. Rosa had been working extra shifts for months while saving for a home. Miguel's family continued, battling medical expenses. These weren't wealthy club members. They were ordinary people working hard to improve their lives, and many of them depended on opportunities connected to programs like the Scholarship Fund. Keanu listened carefully as Marcus explained the challenges. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He simply listened, the same way he had listened to employees throughout the day, the same way he had listened to Miguel, the same way he listened whenever someone else's story mattered more than his own. Across the terrace, guests continued discussing the funding issue. Some pledged additional donations, others offered encouragement. A few promised to explore potential sponsorships, but everyone understood the reality. Replacing a major donor wouldn't be easy. The problem wasn't going away overnight. For the first time since the fundraiser began, uncertainty hung over the event. Yet despite the concern, something interesting happened. Several people noticed that Keanu didn't look worried, not because he didn't care, because he seemed to know something. The calmness that had carried him through every challenge earlier in the day was still there. The same quiet confidence. The same patience. The same thoughtful expression. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't secret knowledge. It was simply the look of someone who understood that difficult situations often reveal the best parts of people. And before the night ended, that belief would prove true. Because while the audience worried about missing funds and uncertain futures, a much bigger truth remained hidden. A truth very few people in attendance knew. A truth that connected Keanu Reeves to the scholarship fund far more deeply than anyone imagined. Within the next hour, stories would begin emerging. Stories about anonymous donations, stories about students whose lives had changed. Stories about support that had arrived quietly when families needed it most, and as those stories spread across Pinecrest Golf Resort, everyone present would finally discover why Charles Beaumont respected Keanu Reeves so deeply. The biggest reveal of the night was still waiting. End of section 7. For several moments after Marcus Webb finished speaking, the terrace remained unusually quiet. The concern surrounding the scholarship fund seemed to settle over the audience like a heavy cloud. Guests continued exchanging worried looks while students sat silently at their tables, trying not to think about what the loss of funding might mean for their futures. The evening had started as a celebration, but now uncertainty had become part of the story. Then something unexpected happened. Marcus stepped away from the podium and looked toward Charles Beaumont. Charles nodded. A brief exchange passed between them. Neither man spoke into a microphone, yet whatever had just been communicated seemed important. Very important. After a few seconds, Charles returned to the stage. The audience immediately focused their attention on him. "There is something I've wanted to share for a long time," Charles said, "and I think tonight is finally the right moment." His voice carried calmly across the terrace. Guests leaned forward. Employees paused their work. Even the scholarship students seemed to sense that something significant was coming. Charles glanced toward Keanu. Keanu immediately shook his head slightly. The reaction caused Charles to smile. "Yes," Charles said. "I know you don't like attention, but some stories deserve to be told." The crowd looked back and forth between them. Confusion quickly replaced concern. Nobody understood where the conversation was going. Not yet. Charles took a deep breath. 4 years ago, when Marcus first created the Daniel Webb Scholarship Fund, we faced a major problem. We had a vision. We had students who needed help. But we didn't have enough funding to launch the program at the level we hoped. Several people nodded. Most hadn't known that. Charles continued. Then a donor stepped forward. The audience listened carefully. A donor who asked for complete privacy. No publicity, no recognition, no photographs, no press releases. Guests exchanged curious looks. The mystery was building. That donor provided enough funding to support the entire first class of scholarship recipients. The terrace became completely silent. Every person present seemed focused on Charles now. For 4 years, that same donor continued supporting students. Quietly, consistently, without asking for anything in return. A few people were beginning to understand, others still looked confused. Charles turned toward Keanu again. This time he didn't wait. That donor was Keanu Reeves. The reaction was immediate. Gasps spread throughout the terrace. Several guests physically turned in their chairs. Others stared at Keanu with open disbelief. For a few seconds, nobody seemed capable of speaking. The revelation hit harder than anyone expected, not because Keanu was wealthy, not because he was famous, because nobody knew, not one person. The support had remained completely anonymous, and suddenly the entire day looked different. The employees he had helped, the patience he had shown, the humility, the kindness, it all made sense. Across the terrace, Marcus Webb stepped forward. His voice carried unmistakable emotion. "I asked Keanu years ago if I could publicly thank him." Marcus smiled. He said no. Laughter moved gently through the crowd. Warm laughter. Emotional laughter. The kind that comes when people realize something beautiful, Marcus continued. He didn't want the students focusing on him. He wanted them focusing on their future. Several scholarship recipients lowered their heads. Others wiped away tears. The emotional impact was impossible to ignore. But the surprises weren't finished, not even close. Charles opened a folder resting on the podium. Inside were several letters. "What most people don't know," Charles said, "is that the scholarship fund wasn't the only thing he helped." Now the audience was completely captivated. Charles held up the first letter. This came from a student who graduated last year. He began reading. The letter described a young athlete who nearly dropped out of college after unexpected medical expenses threatened his education. Anonymous assistance had appeared at exactly the right moment. The student never discovered who provided it, until tonight. Another letter followed. Then another. Then another. Story after story emerged. Students, families, young athletes, people facing impossible situations. Each story shared the same pattern. Help arrived. Lives changed. No credit was taken. The crowd listened in stunned silence. Some guests looked emotional, others looked ashamed, especially those who had judged Keanu earlier. Meanwhile, Employees throughout the resort were beginning to share stories of their own. Miguel sat frozen in his chair, because he suddenly recognized something. Months earlier, a small educational grant had unexpectedly appeared through a community program supporting students like him. The funding allowed him to continue classes he otherwise couldn't afford. At the time, he never learned where the money originated. Now he wondered. Across the room, Thomas remembered hearing about hospitality scholarships funded through private donors. Rosa remembered assistance programs helping local families during difficult times. Every news story seemed connected to the same pattern. Quiet generosity, invisible support, no recognition, no publicity, just help. Pure help. The atmosphere had become intensely emotional. Even Gregory Ashworth sat silently. The confident businessman, who had spent the afternoon judging Keanu, now struggled to meet anyone's eyes. Because every story made his behavior look worse. Not because people were attacking him, because reality was, and reality can be difficult to argue with. Then Charles revealed one final truth. The scholarship fund's current funding problem is real, he said. A worried silence returned. Several students exchanged nervous looks. Charles smiled. But before tonight's event even started, someone had already solved it. Confusion spread again. Marcus smiled. Keanu looked down. The audience immediately understood. Another wave of emotion swept through the terrace. Charles continued. This afternoon, before any of us knew there was a problem, Keanu committed enough funding to protect the scholarship program for the next 5 years. The crowd erupted. Applause filled the terrace. People stood. Some cried. Others simply stared in disbelief. The standing ovation lasted nearly a minute. Keanu looked visibly uncomfortable with the attention. Not embarrassed, just humble. The same humility he had shown all day. When the applause finally settled, he stood and walked slowly toward the podium. The crowd became quiet again. Everyone wanted to hear him speak. Keanu looked across the audience, at the students, at the employees, at the families. Then he smiled. The truth is, somebody helped me when I was younger. The terrace remained silent. And I've always believed that when life gives us an opportunity to help someone else, we should take it. His words were simple. No dramatic speech. No self-promotion. Just honesty. The scholarships matter because the students matter. He looked toward Miguel. Toward the other recipients. Toward their families. Talent should never be limited by circumstance. The crowd responded with another round of applause. But this time it felt different. Deeper, more personal, because they weren't applauding a celebrity. They were applauding character. And as the applause echoed across Pinecrest Golf Resort, one truth became impossible to ignore. The quiet man in the gray hoodie had been the most important person at the resort all along. End of Section 8.
Long after the applause ended, the emotional impact of the evening continued spreading through Pinecrest Golf Resort. Guests remained seated at their tables, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier that day, many people had viewed Keanu Reeves as an ordinary visitor who didn't belong. Now they were looking at him through an entirely different lens. Not because of his fame, not because of his wealth, because of his character. That realization was powerful, and for some people painful. No one felt that pain more deeply than Gregory Ashworth. The businessman sat quietly near the edge of the terrace, staring down at the untouched glass in front of him. Throughout the evening, he had replayed the day's events again and again in his mind. Every sarcastic comment, every judgmental assumption, every moment he had looked at Keanu and decided he knew exactly what kind of person he was. The memories felt different now. Embarrassing, uncomfortable, impossible to justify. The more he thought about them, the worse they became. What troubled Gregory most wasn't that he had misjudged a famous actor. It was that he had completely misjudged a good man. The realization hit harder than any public criticism ever could. Across the terrace, several other guests were experiencing similar feelings. People remembered the whispers. They remembered the laughter at the gate. They remembered the comments about clothing and appearances. Earlier, those moments had seemed harmless. Now they felt small and ugly. Meanwhile, Keanu appeared completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. After speaking briefly at the podium, he returned to his table and continued talking with students, employees, and families. He wasn't discussing himself. He wasn't accepting praise. In fact, he seemed far more interested in hearing other people's stories. That only deepened the contrast. While some people were wrestling with regret, Keanu had already moved on. Near the front of the terrace, Miguel sat with tears in his eyes. For years, he had worried about tuition payments, family expenses, and the future. The scholarship support had changed everything, and now he finally understood why opportunities had appeared when he needed them most. Not because of luck, because someone he had never met believed people deserved a chance. The realization overwhelmed him. Nearby, Thomas felt something similar. The young server remembered dropping the tray earlier that afternoon. He remembered the embarrassment, the fear, the feeling that everyone was judging him. And then he remembered Keanu kneeling beside him to help clean up the mess. At the time, it had felt like a small act of kindness. Now it felt much bigger, because it revealed exactly who Keanu was when nobody was watching. Not when cameras were present. Not when applause was guaranteed. Just during ordinary moments. Those moments often reveal a person's true character. At the front gate, another difficult conversation was unfolding. Dale Hutchins sat alone inside the security booth long after sunset. Through the window, he could see lights glowing from the clubhouse in the distance. He knew what was happening there. News traveled quickly inside Pinecrest. Everyone knew the story now. Everyone knew who Keanu Reeves was. And everyone knew how he had been treated. Dale leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The memories returned immediately. The smirk, the assumptions, the dismissive attitude, the certainty that he didn't belong. For years, Dale had convinced himself he was good at reading people. He believed experience gave him that ability, but now he realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't read Keanu at all. He had judged his clothes, his car, his appearance, nothing more. The truth left him feeling ashamed. Not because anyone had punished him, because nobody had. That somehow made it worse. No angry confrontation had happened. No public humiliation. No revenge. Just the quiet realization that he had failed to treat another person with basic respect. Back inside the clubhouse, Charles Beaumont eventually joined Gregory's table. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Gregory sighed heavily. "I owe someone an apology." Charles nodded. "Probably." The answer wasn't cruel. It was honest. Gregory stared across the terrace toward Keanu. "You know what bothers me most?" Charles waited. Gregory shook his head slowly. "He never once made me feel foolish." Charles smiled. "That's because he wasn't trying to." The words landed with surprising force. Because they were true. At every stage of the day, Keanu had possessed the ability to embarrass people. He could have revealed his identity. He could have corrected everyone. He could have defended himself. Instead, he chose patience. The choice made everyone else's behavior easier to see, and much harder to excuse. As the evening continued, conversations throughout the resort gradually shifted away from Keanu's generosity and toward a different subject. Respect. People discussed how easily assumptions form, how quickly appearances influence judgment, how often good people are overlooked because they don't fit expectations. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. Some guests felt inspired. Others felt humbled. Many felt both. And somewhere among those conversations, Gregory and Dale each reached the same conclusion. The next morning would begin with an apology. Not because anyone demanded it. Because it was the right thing to do. For the first time all day, they understood that clearly. And as the fundraiser continued beneath the warm glow of terrace lights, the focus slowly shifted away from embarrassment and toward something better. Growth. Because sometimes the most important lesson isn't discovering who someone else really is. It's discovering who you have become. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Pinecrest Golf Resort looked just as beautiful as it had the day before, but something about the atmosphere felt different. The tension was gone. The rumors had disappeared. In their place was a quiet sense of reflection that seemed to linger throughout the property. Guests who had attended the fundraiser were still talking about the previous night. Some discussed the scholarship program. Others talked about the students whose lives had been changed. But most conversations eventually returned to the same subject. Keanu Reeves. Not because he was famous, because of the way he had treated people. The lesson seemed to stay with everyone. Near the clubhouse entrance, employees prepared for another day of operations. Golf carts moved across the property. Groundskeepers tended the course. Staff members greeted arriving guests. Life at Pinecrest continued as usual. But before the morning could fully begin, two people had something important they needed to do. Gregory Ashworth and Dale Hutchins were both waiting near the clubhouse terrace. Neither man looked particularly comfortable. They weren't there because someone had ordered them to come. They weren't trying to protect their reputation. They simply wanted to make something right. A few minutes later, Keanu appeared carrying a cup of coffee. He had spent part of the morning walking the course and speaking with several employees before breakfast. Just like the day before, he looked completely relaxed. When he noticed Gregory and Dale waiting nearby, he smiled politely. "Good morning." The simple greeting immediately made both men feel worse, because it contained no resentment, no bitterness, no anger, just kindness. Gregory took a deep breath. "Keanu, I'd like to apologize." The words came slowly, honestly, without excuses, without qualifications. He explained how quickly he had judged someone based on appearance. He admitted that he had allowed assumptions to replace curiosity. He acknowledged every rude comment and every unfair conclusion he had reached before learning the truth. When he finished, the silence felt heavy. Then Keanu smiled. "I appreciate that. Nothing more. No lecture. No embarrassment. No attempt to make Gregory feel worse. Just acceptance." The response seemed to surprise him. Dale stepped forward next. The security guard looked even more uncomfortable. For years, he had been proud of his ability to judge situations quickly. Now he understood how badly that confidence had failed him. "I should have treated you with respect from the beginning," Dale admitted, "whether I knew who you were or not." Keanu nodded. "That's probably true." A few people nearby smiled. Not because the moment was funny, because the answer was gentle, honest, and completely free of hostility. Dale looked relieved. For the first time since the previous day, some of the weight seemed to leave his shoulders. The conversation could have ended there. But Keanu said something neither man expected. "The truth is, we all make assumptions sometimes." Both men listened carefully. "The important thing isn't whether we make mistakes, it's whether we're willing to learn from them." The words were simple, yet they carried more impact than a long speech ever could, because they offered something many people struggle to give: grace. Around the resort, the story continued spreading. Employees talked about the apology. Members discussed the fundraiser. Students shared their excitement about the future. And throughout every conversation, one thing remained consistent. People felt inspired. Miguel learned that his scholarship support was secure. For the first time in years, he could focus on his education without constantly worrying about how he would pay for it. The future suddenly looked possible again. Thomas continued pursuing his hospitality degree while working at Pinecrest. The confidence he gained from the previous day's events stayed with him long afterward. Rosa and several other employees received recognition from management for their hard work and dedication. Even Charles Beaumont began reviewing ways to improve employee development programs throughout the resort. The positive effects reached far beyond a single fundraiser, far beyond a single apology. Because kindness has a way of creating momentum. One good action often inspires another. Then another's. Then another's. By late afternoon, Keanu prepared to leave Pinecrest Golf Resort. Several employees gathered near the entrance to say goodbye. Not because he was a celebrity, because they genuinely liked him. Miguel thanked him. Thomas thanked him. Rosa thanked him. Many others did the same. Keanu accepted every word graciously, but he always redirected the attention toward them. Toward their goals. Toward their futures. Toward the opportunities ahead. As he climbed into his rental car, Charles Beaumont walked over one final time. "I'm glad you came." Keanu smiled. "So am I." The two men shook hands. Then Keanu drove away. No dramatic exit. No celebration. No attention-seeking moment. Just a quiet departure that perfectly matched everything people had learned about him. For a long time after the car disappeared down the road, many of those standing there remained silent. They weren't thinking about money, or status, or appearances. They were thinking about character. Because the most important person at Pinecrest that weekend hadn't arrived in a luxury vehicle. He hadn't worn expensive clothes. He hadn't demanded respect. He earned it through kindness. And in doing so, he taught everyone around him something they would never forget. Sometimes the people we underestimate reveal who we truly are. Respect should never depend on money, clothes, or status. The strongest people don't demand respect. They give it. And the people who seem ordinary often carry extraordinary character. The end.